in some sense, it was by chance, in effect. I was teaching at York at the time, and there were a large, substantial number of Italian students who came to York, partly because they wished to study public finance. And then one of those at York who came from Napoli then became my PhD student, that is Patrizia. And then I was going to Italy, I think it was in 1986, for a conference on Kalecki in Perugia. And Patrizia invited me to go down to Naples to give a seminar there. And that's where I first came across Augusto Graziani. I have to confess, I hadn't come across his writings before. And it was really coming across the circuitous approach, which is much of what we spoke about when I was with him, but also more general issues to do with Keynes and Keynesian economics. So it was, in a sense, chance, but it was a fruitful chance, should we say. Well, I should first say one of the outcomes of that meeting in Napoli was that eventually Philip Orestes agreed to publish in the Thames Papers in Political Economy series Augusto Graziani's paper on the theory of the monetary circuit. And in one sense, I'm rather proud of that, because I think it did introduce the circuitous approach into the UK. I'm sure there were people in the UK before who knew about it, but it wasn't exactly at the forefront of our knowledge. So that it was an introduction to the post-Keynesian knowledge. I think, in a sense, from there, for quite some time, I didn't particularly incorporate Graziani's work into my own thinking. And I think it came much later. And then in terms of building on the initial finance, final finance distinction, which I always found particularly helpful. Now, it fitted in at least in my mind, to some in terms of the endogenous money approach and the way in which money was created and introduced into circulation, and that to some extent linked over with issues like inflation and the way that money would be introduced in order to help finance production and indeed finance higher costs. But the workings in terms of looking at the monetary circuit in a broader context, I think only was really within the last 10 years in my case. I think it has some links with Kalecki, because I think one can find in Kalecki, if you read deeply enough, as it were, aspects of talking about how production would be financed in the banking system, or particularly actually in the case of Kalecki, more investment. But also, although this doesn't play by any means a central part, the way in which government expenditure would need to be financed in some way, linking it with the central bank and so forth. So I would see overlaps with Kalecki, but I think that may be straining it to take it a long way. But I think this idea that I find particularly helpful in terms of the distinction between initial finance and final finance is when it is applied to government expenditure and to the financing of government expenditure. So the notion from initial finance, which I suppose links over with to some extent with modern monetary theory, is that the central bank has in some sense to provide the finance in order to enable government expenditure to occur. So that is where the initial finance comes from. And then but also to draw the distinction between the initial finance and what would be called final finance, or one could call funding. And I think when you come to issues over that old question of if any new expenditure is proposed, then where's the money coming from? And at one level, there's two answers to that. One is to say, well, yes, it comes from in the first instance, the initial finance being provided by the central bank, but it also, in terms of the final finance and the funding of it, is a reminder that there will be a resulting budget deficit which has to be funded in some way, and where do the funds come from that, and what is the relationship in the context of government expenditure and deficit, what proportion will in fact come from bonds being issued, and what will come from the money which is being created remaining in circulation. I think one part, which is maybe not quite related to the question, is the issue to do with bank-based versus market-based financial systems. And I think from the notion that banks have to supply loans and money in order to enable production to expand, means that is, in a way, the crucial role of banks. And so one cannot have a purely market-based system. One has to have a key role for banks. So it's a comparison really between a bank-based system and a bank-based plus market system. So I think it helps in that sort of area. On the other hand, one could say that the process of financialization not exactly downgrades the initial finance, because it places much more emphasis on the final finance and the funding, and the way in which the financial assets and liabilities are created, and as under financialization, that there's a large growth in the scale of the financial assets and liabilities, and the exchanges which are going on, as it were, in the financial markets plays a bigger role than it, in a sense, it would have done in the initial analysis of Graziani and the initial finance and final financing. But I think in a way it is also I suppose important to keep the distinction between, well, the initial finance is in fact the granting of credit to enable the expenditure and so on to proceed, and then what happens when the savings occur and that is turned into, as it were, into financial assets and liabilities, and how that proceeds.